This is Maureen for the Raw and Radical on Display podcast, conversations with amazing women in the arts. Welcome to Raw and Radical on Display. This is your host, Maureen, and today we are talking with Angela Fraleigh. Angela, you're a painter working with oil and mixed media. You also work with pencil and watercolors. You explore themes such as femininity, sexuality, gender, and most specifically power dynamics in a very unique style that blends figurative painting, abstraction, classicism, and realism. You're also a professor and a department chair. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. I really like the way your work inspires and touches various dimensions. It seems that your painting reach and vibrates in an aura that is very big, that transcends just the now. It goes backwards and forwards, and it creates a whole universe in themselves. I feel like we are very drawn to your paintings. It's almost like we can enter them, or maybe they are entering our world. And I was wondering how you started to do those big scale paintings.
Thank you so much. That's such a beautiful description of my work. I'm very flattered. Yeah, I mean, basically you described everything that I'm hoping the work does. I've been working large scale for a really long time, since undergrad, actually, since it's just a scale that I'm really comfortable at, but it also helps serve conceptual meaning in that for me, it's kind of taking these personal or intimate moments and really making them much more heroic. We're forced to see intricacies of body language at that kind of scale. We're forced to view these, what would be in my more recent work, boudoir paintings, images of women that would kind of exist in the bedroom to inspire activities that would happen there. I've elevated these figures up to a much more heroic scale so that they kind of loom over us in a much more kind of powerful way.
Completely, yeah.
It's hard to consume them in the same way you would if it were at that smaller easel painting scale. They kind of hover over us instead of us kind of being, looming over them. So that's important that the scale is there. I'm also really interested, more recently too, in this idea of walking into an immersive space where I love that you kind of pulled that out, because it's like we're kind of sucked into this space where it's almost like a feminist utopian space where the ghosts of the past or the figures of the future are kind of all around, and maybe, conjurings, kind of unseen forces to, change the experience that we're in right now for women specifically, but for all marginalized figures, I think.
Oh, I really like this idea. I think it's really nice. Kelly Baum, the contemporary curator at the Metropolitan Museum, she talks about your work as utopic provocations. And I think this is such good descriptions because they are utopic, but in a way they provoke reality. And they really provoke us because some aspect of them are so realistic. And some aspects are so angel-like in a way. And so I really like this notion of, in your work, that comes out of really creating a new reality. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on this a little bit, and, about how we can create a reality, and a completely new reality that you do for your paintings. But I think it goes much more further than that, right?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I've been toying with the notion. It's something that's kind of been in the ethers for a while now for a lot of friends that I know. This notion that we might create our own reality simply by thinking about them. And there's also this idea that you get what you think about, whether you want it or not. which I find really fascinating. And I kind of see it play out in my life on a regular basis. And so recently I've been asking the question, if that's true, then what are we thinking about on a regular basis that has gotten us to the kind of political space that we're in right now, this kind of political landscape,
Yes.
our social realities, the kinds of division. And we're in this really interesting time right now where all of the kind of gunky, repressed, oppressed seems to be kind of coming to the surface. And the politicians, well, in America, it's Trump and the Republican Party, have actually created this incredible seed bed for all of this stuff to come up and out into the table. It's kind of like a real purging, from my point of view anyway, seeing the real ugliness of where we are to some extent. I mean, obviously, I was devastated in 2016 when he was voted into office, but I'm actually now seeing it as a real opportunity to kind of see the kinds of things that we've created and where we can go from here. What can we create now that we see where we're at? And so from my point of view, I've been wanting to think about, well, what do I want instead of what don't I want? And what I do want is a kind of egalitarian society where people feel like they can make the lives that they want for themselves. I want people to have more of an even playing field from the start.
Yes.
I want systemic racism and systemic sexism and homophobia and all of these things to be something of the past, right? Or at least something that we're actively working against. Or actively creating something in opposition to, if that makes sense. So rather than focusing on the stuff I don't want, I'm focusing on what I do want. And what I do want are these big utopian feminist societies that are much more nurturing and not maternal, but where people feel comfortable and safe to create the world they want to live in. So that's kind of what I'm making right now in my paintings.
Yeah. And to be themselves.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Because when you think about it, I mean, everything that was ever created in this world, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, came from an idea, came from a thought and an impulsion from within, in a way, or through us, or, however you believe works about creation, but it comes from us. It comes from something completely immaterial.
Yeah.
And then we create it. So all the ugliness that is created and that has been created, in our world comes from an idea and comes from a choice. And this is actually really amazing when you think about it, because it was all made with a purpose, in a way. It was all created by choice with a specific reason.
Yeah.
And this is nuts.
Well, I think even about the way in which you and I are able to talk right now came from a desire of people wanting to connect with people across the globe, right? That's how we have the internet. That's how we have, telephone structures. That's how we have, all of the technology that we have available to us now came from a desire, came from nothing.
Yeah.
Right?
And that means that we are very powerful because we can create anything. And it's true that it's very difficult on a daily basis. And I would even go even further by say on a momentary basis to really choose the thoughts we want to have, because sometimes we lose control over that. It's very easily to go into negativity and noise and all that, but to know that we have that power to choose the thoughts and to have a lot of power, to actually create something new. It's really amazing. In your work, there is a lot of power dynamics. I mean, some of you drawings and watercolor with two people in it, you can really feel that very strongly. And I mean, through all your work, you can feel the power dynamic. I wanted to bring out this idea of power dynamic and how it relates to your work and your life.
Yeah, I think from an early stage, I've been interested in power dynamics and how we get what we want with what we've got from where we are. I've questioned that for a long time. In the very beginning, and I think still now, I'm thinking about how meaning gets made. And by that, I mean how we come to believe the things that we believe. Because I think at the structure of all power dynamics, how people abuse power, how people gain power, it comes from what they believe, what they believe is possible, what they believe about themselves, what they believe about the world around them.
Yeah.
And so early on, I was kind of looking just at the imagery around me, looking at advertisements, looking at movies, looking at the ways in which people are portrayed in television series or literature, and wondering what kinds of subconscious messages were being sent in those spaces. So wondering specifically about gender, because that was my own personal experience, but also about, issues of race and class, economic stature, political structures, etc. So, this was happening for me in the early 90s. Heroin chic was very in at the time. And so you were literally seeing these gorgeous women laying dead from an overdose in magazines. And that was there to kind of sell boots or whatever, So I was kind of curious about that. And then, fast forward to different music videos or the ways in which women are portrayed in film. These are just the way, we look at images and movies from 50 years ago and we can really see how stark these portrayals of women or people of color, how wrong they were. But what's happening right now in our current media structure that are still furthering those notions and kind of cementing those ideas of certain power dynamics. So I guess that's where my initial quest came from. Currently, I'm looking at how that functions in art history, in what seem like somewhat benign images of beautiful women. I'm curious how we can kind of activate those figures and see them anew by just deciding to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Your work really questions the place of women through art history. And I feel you are changing the dynamic in a way, the way you place women in your work and bringing a new avenue. And to me, this is, there's something really fresh about it. But something really new, and there's almost some kind of a power shift. Do you see it the same way, or?
I hope that that's what the work is doing. I'm never sure, that's just the experience of being an artist. You kind of do the thing and then you hope it does the thing that you thought it might do in the beginning, but maybe doesn't do, I don't know. But I'm working with images that have been created either by women or by men of women throughout art history. But I'm also looking back to find any sort of invisible histories or dormant narratives that surround women from art history. So, for instance, I just did an exhibition at the Edward Hopper House Museum in Nyack, New York. It's Edward Hopper's boyhood home. And it's a small historic house in this beautiful little riverside town. And what I knew when I was invited to make a proposal for the exhibition, that I was going to do something in response to Edward Hopper's women, the women in his paintings, because oftentimes you can't quite see their face. They're somewhat isolated or alienated. They're in these quiet, cityscapes or landscapes. What I didn't know when I was doing research for the exhibition, though, is that almost all of the women after 1924 in his paintings are all of his wife, Jo. And Jo Nivison Hopper, was actually an artist, and she was far more well-known than he was when they got married. But when they got married, her career tanked and his skyrocketed. And part of that was because of the work that she did to help him. She was exhibiting at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and she convinced the curator to give up some of her wall space for his watercolors as well. She also helped him sell a painting. He hadn't sold a painting in 10 years. He was basically just getting by, working as an illustrator. And I just found it really fascinating, what happened. Not only, what happened to her work. Was her work just not of the caliber? Did her work change? What did she do to help support him? And so those were a lot of the questions that I asked. And the installation ended up being, the walls were covered with this wall treatment that was inspired by her palette. She had a really vibrant kind of faux modernist palette. Thank you. And then I painted these portraits of a contemporary model dressing up as Joe, dressing up for Hopper's women. Because what I found interesting is, she was posing for all these paintings, but they were never of her. They were always a stand-in for a woman. And Hopper's even talked about the paintings as being about him. So this notion of her kind of being seen through, even when she's being stared at, I wanted to play with that idea and how that relates to contemporary concerns for women and women artists of today, right? So that's what that work was about. And so power dynamics, not only in terms of the way women's bodies are presented and used and more like vessels than, thinking human beings, but also about these kinds of invisible stories that we're missing. And that if I ask this question to myself all the time, like if I had known about all these heroes, if they were kind of the ones that were pitched to me, would I be different? Would I feel more powerful as a woman? And can I do that for women coming forward? Can I help kind of create more stories of heroism that are female protagonist driven?
Yes.
And what can that do for women moving forward? I guess that's always my question,
Yeah, absolutely. And this is fascinating. When you talk about your work, you talk about the fact that you alternate a lot between chance and control. And I really like this idea of, having control, but also knowing when to let go. And this is a good metaphor for our lives in general. But I was wondering if you can talk a bit about that and explain your process.
Well, I don't know exactly when it started. I think I had a really bad critique from someone I really admire about 15 years ago. He said something like, they're beautiful paintings, but they behave really well. And I thought that was just like a dagger in my heart, I thought I was making these things that were, rebellious and, in your face and somewhat aggressive, and to have them behave well just felt like this good girl kind of thing that I didn't want to have happening anymore. So I had been working with the canvases on the floor, and I had a bunch of extra medium in my hand, and I was still really kind of controlling about how I was putting paint on the canvas, even though they were horizontal, not vertical. And I just, after this critique, it wasn't like this kind of furious, angered, aggressive, but I ended up pouring a bunch of leftover stuff I had in a cup. And I left, and I came back the next day. And what the medium and oil paint had done was move under this kind of wet figuration that I had created, and it started to kind of canker and cover parts of the painting in ways that were so fascinating and so beautiful and grotesque at the same time, that I then decided to make it a very active part of my process. And so since then, I've been just really enamored and kind of seduced by the way in which kind of paint could be an active participant. It could become a protagonist in the narrative. It could be this element that I don't control, but I get to play with and collaborate with, if that makes sense. Yeah. So
absolutely.
But I can't give up my control because I love painting the way that I paint too. I love painting traditionally as well. So yeah, I don't know. And it depends. Some people think it works well. Some people think it doesn't work, and it doesn't matter because that's just, where I'm at. It's what I do.
I really like the contrast and the tension between the two. I think it's excellent.
Thank you.
And, I use also, a color to cover my photograph. So I can only be attracted to your work in a way. But I'm really curious about this idea and how you use this idea of covering and uncovering identity, I feel, and how it relates to the world and the society we live in that is covering and uncovering our identity, or how we can push through and uncovering our face. Because you also work with the covering of the face, with hair, covering the face, masks. That brings me to the idea of the ritual in your work, rituals and the symbolism of ritual and the unseen forces, and there's a lot of energies and realities in your work that is unseen, and it's very strong. I think some of the tensions are really strong.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that word tension, because I think it's really powerful. It's a powerful tool. I think, early on too, I remember having a conversation with someone who was a real horror movie fan, and I am not. I cannot watch horror movies because I'm too emotionally seduced, and I, would be creating a living nightmare for myself if I were to watch horror movies. But I remember him saying that a lot of people say that the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre was actually the most terrifying, even though it didn't have the same levels of gore or, and a lot of theorists say that that's actually because it doesn't show as much, because there's something about that restraint, that not knowing, the unseen, that is far more powerful than revealing all. And so I started thinking, how can I use that to my advantage in these scenarios? So the early paintings, the power dynamics are unclear. You're not quite sure if the female character is a victim in this scenario or a volunteer. They're very binary in some respects. There's usually a male and a female character. They're usually either in this rather beautiful, intimate embrace, a sexualized space, or there's something violent happening. And you can't quite tell, hopefully, that was my hope, in any instance, who has the power in this scenario.
Yeah, totally true. Totally true.
And I've been, using, coupling the seen with the unseen to play with that tension, to play with that space, and to kind of put it back on the person looking at the image, because I think it speaks volumes about what you see when you see it, because it's in that almost neutral space where you can kind of project onto the image what you think is happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But lately I'm using, as you mentioned, those unseen forces in a more kind of holistic or healing realm. I'm thinking about it more as a, I have a show coming up at the Delaware Art Museum, and I'm using figures from the pre-Raphaelite era and the golden age of American illustration, mainly because they have a lot of that in their collection. And I'm thinking about a lot of these women from the pre-Raphaelite era met their end through opium overdose.
Wow.
It's really interesting. I mean, you could buy laudanum on the corner, we're globally going through another opioid crisis where it's readily available. People are kind of meeting their end because it's a highly addictive drug as well. But I think a lot of women that were associated with the pre-Raphaelites, they had certain levels of, they could maneuver to some degree, but they could only go so far. And I think no matter what, when you limit someone and you create such a small lane to walk within, especially big spirits, like some of the women that were associated with this movement, I'm thinking about these almost hallucinatory spaces. And I'm thinking about, like I said, restoring power to some of these figures. It's almost like wish fulfillment or, just imagining alternative histories or alternative possibilities that would have kind of created different realities today, and maybe could create different realities moving forward. I mean, that's a little out there and it's a little spacey, but it's kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm conjuring their spirits and, just reimagining a different reality for these incredible women of the past, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes absolutely total sense.
Does it?
Yeah, because in your work, I see there's something really inspiring about them for our everyday life. When I'm just looking at one side of it, because the power dynamics are so strong. It's almost like it's a reminder that this is what life is about. Life is about power dynamics, and life is about making sure that, you keep your strength, making sure that you go the right direction, that you make the right choices, that it's something constant. It's never something that you acquire and then that's it. It's a bit like happiness. You cannot say, oh, now I'm happy and I'm good for the rest of my life, or
Right.
or I have something and it's good for the rest of it. It's in constant change, and they really remind us that. I feel that this is life. That's why for me they're so alive. They're more than painting. They really come alive.
Oh,
and they reach us strongly. And I think this is really amazing.
oh, thank you.
Yeah, I also wanted to talk to you about the power of color and symbolism in your art. Because I feel like your use of color is really refined and really strong. You use strong colors. You use a strong mix of colors. Very powerful again. And I like the symbolism because you also use animals, a lot of animals. And I was wondering if you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, the first time I brought animals into the work, I was thinking about using this animal hunt. It was a boar hunt, and this boar was being attacked by dogs. And I used that as a metaphor for something that was too difficult or painful to look directly at. We can almost, I'm a vegetarian and I love animals, so it's actually hard for me to look at animals being hurt also. But this was just a way that I could kind of look at a psychological trauma and use it as a stand-in. But since then, I've used it in other ways, the animal figures in other ways. So color for me feels like, I don't know if you read this book, it's a really excellent book called Chromophobia by David Batchelor. And in it, he kind of locates these periods throughout history where color has been put up against black and white or a range of grays. Color is this wild, erotic, kind of uncontrollable element, whereas, black and white is the rational, it's the steady, it's the reason element. And I was thinking about how, like he posits, like something like Wizard of Oz, for instance, it's all very black and white. And then once you get into the dreamscape, it's full color. And then there was that movie Pleasantville not too many years ago, where similarly, it's a black and white world until someone has, a passionate kind of kindling of emotion, right? Like, and sex is all wild and colorful. And so I've used it in that way throughout my body of work as well.
Nice.
More recently with the Edward Hopper House Museum, I used it as a blaring, feminine kind of this is Joe's personality was blaring from the walls. And then, the women become almost, an afterthought when you walk into that space because it's so loud with her. I was using it as a metaphor for her, but right now I'm thinking the color is a very feminine space, a very, I love that sense of unpredictability or power that might come from being immersed in a really vibrant space like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know that book, but I'm going to go read it right away.
Yeah. Oh, it totally makes sense for you. Yeah, absolutely.
You have children, and I wanted to ask you, how do you sustain your creative practice with everything that must be going around you and your life and your family, and
Yeah, thankfully I'm in a economic position where I can afford daycare. I have a great support structure. My mom lives right next door, which is huge. And she is really involved and really loves spending time with her grandkids, which is very helpful. I have, an amazing partner who, plays an equal role in their upbringing. So that also helps. But it's difficult. It's really hard because as an artist, I should also say my husband is an artist. And so that we have this understanding where we know what it's like when you're on deadline. And so he will kind of, like, thankfully we don't have too many situations where we're both on deadline, but when we are, it's a very fine-tuned dance of like how we all put it together. And I have to like plan like way ahead of time how to kind of set up my life. So yeah, that's how that works. Thankfully, I mean, you know how it is as an artist. It's like, I used to have all this time. It's like I would work the day job and then I'd come home and I would still have 5 hours that I could work in the studio. It's no longer, now it's until the kids go to bed. And unfortunately, my oldest child's a night owl. So like, that part's hard. So I have to cram a bunch of work in one daycare day. I don't have weekends anymore in the same way I used to. So but I've learned to be really efficient with my time. I don't overthink things as much because there's just no time to do that, which is a blessing and a curse, right? And I think like as women in the studio, it's like, that's actually been a really great development in the process. Is like, I just can't sit and look anymore, which I just have to do more, and I can look when I'm with the kids. So that's kind of changed a little bit, but yeah, I don't know if that helps. I don't know how. I just have my head down and power through most of the time.
Yeah. And focus is something important, to keep the focus on what we want, I think. Do you have any last advice you want to share? Anything you learned through your career you want to share?
I think that just reaching out, doing exactly what you're doing right now is really amazing. And just something we all need to do more of is lean on each other and support one another and connect, like just really make connections. Because what I've been thinking about a lot is, what's it all for? I think that the patriarchal structure that we've all kind of been seduced by throughout our lives, it has this sense that there's like a ladder that you can climb and that you won't really be happy until you get to whichever rung you're at. And then you'll look around and then you'll want more. And that's okay. That's great. But it's the waiting to be happy part that's not okay. Right? And I'm curious what a matriarchal society would look like. I have no idea if it'd be any better, but I do wonder if it would be a little bit more level and a little bit more fertile and a little bit more spacious and more room for more voices and ideas to kind of, fester in a good way. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense to me, because I'm a true believer that to change the world and make the world a better place, it starts with our heart, and it starts with following our heart. And I think a lot of people do not, for many reasons, do not follow their desire, their heart truly. And it creates a world where there's a lot of unhappiness, because of cultural beliefs, family belief system, whatever, or just economics in a general way. And that if we can be each of us a bit closer to our heart and to our truth, then the world will change, and this is done one person at a time, really. And it seems like an impossible task, but I think it's totally possible. And I think we see it every day. It's like what we were talking about, earlier, when we say it starts with a thought, and how to choose, to actually follow your heart instead of, follow a belief. And I was questioning a lot the other day. I was thinking, sometimes we think we don't have a choice. And why is that? And I realized it's because sometimes we just don't know better, So we think we have no choice. So I'm hoping, that because, we share more of our stories, each of us, each story is different, and we each have to learn from each other. That's for sure. So I'm hoping that it's going to open possibilities.
I'm reminded by a quote that someone just said the other day, and I don't know who, but they made the best decision and the best choice with the thinking that they had. Because it spotlights thinking as this thing that you're also choosing. Do you know what I mean? Like, so if you're in a certain belief structure and you don't see any other way outside of that set of beliefs, you're going to make a set of decisions from that line of thinking.
Exactly.
But if you can blow up that thinking and think a totally different set of beliefs, then you'll make choices from that kind of thinking. And that could be just revolutionary for yourself and everyone around you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm cutting myself, you know, sometimes thinking, but I am blinded. I am blinded by some of the stuff I believe, you know, and I'm trying not to be every day, but I'm still am at some level.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing how convincing we can be to our own detriment.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to remember we only have our 5 senses to understand the world we live in. And that's why the world of feelings and things that are more subtle and more vibrational, more energetic, and intuition and things like that is very important. I think with art and through art, we can reach those levels. You know, it's like we take them, we transform them, we bring them to our life, and then they go back to the invisible realm, but they're still there. So I really like that that idea, actually. You want to talk about your upcoming shows?
I have 2 solo museum exhibitions I'm working on right now. One at the Delaware Art Museum, which will be inspired by the Pre-Raphaelite collection that I think I mentioned earlier, and then the Golden Age of American Illustration.
Amazing.
I'm creating this kind of hallucinatory, immersive feminist utopia that I was talking about earlier.
Nice.
So I'm very excited about it. I don't actually know how to talk about it very well because I'm in it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm very excited about that. And then I have an exhibition at the Reading Public Museum out here in Pennsylvania. And that work will be about, they have a large collection of landscape painting, and I'm making work specifically about the coming of age fairy tales, not the fairy tales that we're used to that kind of Disney kind of sanitized over the years, but more like these erotic and violent wonder tales that were told the world over by women to women.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so we'll see how that goes too.
I love this word, wonder tales. I really like that.
Yeah.
This is great. And how about sharing? You have a great blog on your website.
Yeah, I haven't been active with that recently, but it was similar to what, in some ways, what you're doing is just trying to kind of create more conversation in the world and, you know, in the art world. Specifically, I started it for my students so that they might see ways to move forward after graduation and kind of just talk to artists about what they've done. But it kind of maneuvered into different things too. And so, yeah.
I recommend to everybody to have a look at it
on
the website.
Thanks.
I think it's really good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yay. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Have a great weekend.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please leave me comments or questions. Don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter and follow us on social media. Until next time, get lost, dream, and shine.